Hi, this is an attempt to recap what we've talked about in class about Rule 19, required and indispensable parties. So first, a quick overview. Um, Although we're talking about Rule 19 in the context of joinder of parties, it's a very strange joinder rule in that unlike all the other rules we've talked about, usually when this rule is raised, it's not actually raised to join a party, but in an attempt to dismiss for failure to join a Rule 19 party. So, unlike most of the rules where either the plaintiff or a defendant wants to join a party, Rule 19 is used in conjunction with a Rule 12 motion to dismiss to try to usually dismiss the case. Most often it's raised by the defendant since the defendant wants to try to dismiss the case. It would not make sense for a plaintiff to raise a Rule 19 motion to dismiss because the plaintiff wants the case to continue. In addition to being a weird joinder rule, it's also strangely written. There's primarily two major provisions of 19, 19A and B, and yet the process for evaluating whether you have a Rule 19 party such that you can dismiss the case is actually a three-step process, not a two-step process. So two of those process steps are actually both in 19A, as we'll shortly talk about. Now, let's move on to talk about briefly Rule 12 before we talk about Rule 19. So I mentioned that Rule 19 is raised usually as a Rule 12 defense. So you should remember that there's a number of Rule 12 defenses you have. On the left, I only excerpted the part about failure to join a party under Rule 19, which we haven't focused on that much so far. But you should remember some of the other defenses include things like lack of SMJ, lack of PJ, lack of proper venue, and also failure to state a claim. You should also remember that some Rule 12 defenses are waived if they're not appropriately made. And you should remember that only the defenses listed in 12b2 through 5 are in fact waivable defenses. Now, obviously, 7 is not within 2 through 5, so it's not waivable. What you might also remember is the waivable defenses all have something in common in that those are all things you should be able to figure out at the beginning of the lawsuit exists, such as whether there is PJ or whether there is or is not a venue. On the other hand, Rule 12b7, failure to join a Rule 19 party, falls under 12h2, similar to failure to state a claim. What both of these defenses have in common, in addition to that they're not waived, is that they're separated because, one, you cannot waive them. It just changes when you can raise them. And also, two, it is entirely possible that you might not be aware of these defenses at the beginning of the lawsuit. So whereas anyone who actually knows the FRCiv Pro rules will know whether or not there is PJ over them, you may not have enough information at the beginning of the case as a defendant to know whether or not someone is a Rule 19 party such that they should be joined or else the case dismissed. So that's just a brief overview of how Rule 19 fits in the context of Rule 12 and how this is a strange joinder rule in that it revisits Rule 12 motions. So now we're going to move on to the actual rule itself and who is a Rule 19 party. Now to start with, I've excerpted just parts from Rule 19A and B. These are the primary parts of Rule 19 that we're going to look at. So the first thing you look at is if you have a Rule 19 required party. I didn't list out all of this rule because I'm trying to emphasize the two parts of Rule 19 that we're focusing on. Only if you have a Rule 19 party who you cannot join because there's no SMJ or PJ, will you then move on to 19B, which is titled When Joinder is Not Feasible, and they're talking about joinder of the 19A required party. So only if you can't join them do you then evaluate whether you should either continue without them or dismiss the entire case, which you should know by now is a very harsh remedy. Now, going back to 19A1, required party, there's basically three situations when you have a possible Rule 19A party, which we're going to look at in more detail. But right now, I want you to look at the green part. So the green part only applies if you decide that you have a 19A party under the parts that we haven't talked about yet. Even if you do, then you have to look at what the green part is telling you. And it talks about how you have to join the party if they're subject to service of process, which you should know as code for a type of jurisdiction that we talked about under Rule 4. In particular, you should remember that we talked about under 4K1 that when you formally serve someone process, that means they are then subject to PJ. So what this is saying is that the person who is subject to PJ, and also if joinder does not deprive the court of SMJ, has to be joined if they're a Rule 19 party. Now, if you're wondering why the court would be deprived of SMJ, you have to remember that you might not have SMJ if you don't have complete diversity. And also that if you are using supplemental jurisdiction, the 1367B bar applies not just to original plaintiffs who try to use it, but also proposed plaintiffs who would fall on the plaintiff side and for whom there would not be complete diversity if they are joined. So even if you have PJ, if you would lack complete diversity because of possibly the 1367B bar, that would be a problem such that you then have to go to 19B. So the way the Rule 19 analysis works out is you first look and see, is the Rule 19A party necessary? Do they fall within one of the categories of A1? If your answer is yes, you then move on to the second question, which is, can this currently non-party be joined? And to answer this question, you are really asking, can they be joined in that is there PJ over them, and is there also SMJ, such that diversity will not be disturbed? If you can join them, you are done with your analysis. But if you cannot, either because there's no PJ, there's no SMJ, or because they object to venue, then you have to move on to the next category, which is the 19B factors, which consider a number of different factors in evaluating whether or not you really need that party. Now, there is old language about 19B which talks about the party being indispensable if the suit really cannot continue without them. The current rule doesn't use that, but a lot of the cases do. Regardless of what term you use, if the court decides you really can't proceed without that party, then the solution is to dismiss the entire case. Now let's go back and move on to 19A parties. So here are, in more detail, the categories of 19A parties. Now I said that there's three categories here under A and B. A talks about how without the absentee you cannot have complete relief. This commonly happens if, for example, someone is suing for injunctive relief or specific performance and not all the relevant parties are included. Oftentimes, even if this is met, the courts still look at the other categories. So we'll continue on as well. Now, under B, you have two subsections. Each one applies to a different party. So B little one talks about impairing the interests of the non-party, whereas B little two is talking about the interests and harm to the current party. So for B little one, we're looking to see whether failure to join them will practically impair their ability to protect their interests. So this could be a case where if the current plaintiff is suing and trying to get money from a limited pool of money, if the non-party is not joined, their ability to later sue could be impaired because maybe all the funds will be exhausted. That's one possibility. Another possibility is maybe the non-party has an interest that will be impaired if they're not joined. For example, they have an employee whose interests they would like to preserve in terms of keeping the employee working for them, such that if they're not part of the case, they can't adequately represent that interest. Another possibility is moving on to the existing parties' possible liability for double, multiple, or inconsistent obligations. Now, it's really important that this phrase is inconsistent obligations and not inconsistent judgments. So in general, failure to include a joint tortfeasor would not result in inconsistent obligations, because you might have inconsistent judgments in terms of deciding who's liable, but usually an inconsistent obligation is talking about things that you can't both do at the same time. For example, one court ruling say you have to build a building, and another court ruling saying you're not allowed to build a building. Or a court ruling saying that a current employee is enjoined from working because they're going to otherwise take away somebody's trade secrets, would be inconsistent with that employee's obligation to obey their current employment contract. So in that case, you have two inconsistent obligations, not by different courts, but nonetheless legal obligations. Another scenario we haven't talked about yet, where you could have an inconsistent obligation, could be two different court orders if a existing party wants something, and that would preclude or result in the current defendant having inconsistent obligations. So for example, there's a case about a mall where they're trying to give exclusive space in the mall to one particular jewelry store, Tiffany's. Now, if they do this, the mall could result in inconsistent obligations if later on another jewelry store wants to sue and try to get the same exclusive space. Now, if you're talking about an exclusive store, there's only one store that can be exclusive. So if not all the possible jewelry stores are joined now, then the mall might be subject to inconsistent obligations. So that's an overview of some of the 19A categories. And assuming you have at least one of them, then you are evaluating whether that party is someone who the court has PJ and SMJ over. If you do, then technically they have to be joined. If not, then you move on to 19B. Now, we just said PJ and SMJ. Venue is also potentially relevant if the non-party objects. That's in Part 3, which is noted at the bottom. If they don't object, it's not a problem because, as you remember, venue is not a constitutional issue. Now let's move on to another issue, or rather application of this rule. So using the same criteria, let's review the Temple case, which we talked about in class, where the poor patient whose screws fell off after surgery sues only the manufacturer of the screws and not the doctor or the hospital, which would be also contributory liability. So the current non-parties who are not sued are the doctor and the hospital. So looking at these categories, the first one is whether in the person's absence, in the absence of the doctor and hospital, the plaintiff can get complete relief from just the manufacturer. Now remember, the plaintiff is seeking money damages, and if we're talking about torts and joint and several liability, which we are in Civ Pro, any one defendant can provide complete relief because each joint tortfeasor is 100% liable to the plaintiff. Now, even if there are other joint tortfeasors, they can thereafter sue the other joint tortfeasors for contribution. Alternatively, they could also implead one of the tortfeasors under Rule 14. But in terms of the question whether the plaintiff can get complete relief, the short answer is yes, the plaintiff can get complete relief from just the manufacturer. But let's look at some of the other categories as well. The next issue is whether the non-party, the doctor, under 19b little 1, would have an interest that would be practically impaired or impeded if not joined. In this case, the doctor probably doesn't really want to be part of this suit in terms of being sued. They don't really have an interest that's going to be practically impaired or impeded. There is also another question of whether an existing party, i.e. the screw manufacturer, is going to be subject to the risk of multiple or inconsistent obligations. As we said in the last slide, this doesn't necessarily mean that there will be two different lawsuits where maybe they're found liable in one and not the other, because if you're talking about different amounts of money, that's not an inconsistent obligation. Also, I just wanted to reinforce, although you might think that they might be prejudiced without these parties, that's not necessarily true. Even if they wanted to establish that they were not the only ones liable, they can do that without including these other current non-parties. As we'll talk about next week, you can get discovery from people who are not actually parties to the lawsuit. In addition, you can bring in evidence and witnesses from people who are not parties. So not having these other people as parties does not necessarily result in prejudice. In addition, prejudice, just general prejudice, is not the standard. What we're looking at is whether the existing party is going to be subject to double or inconsistent obligations. And that's not necessarily true here, in that they won't be able to do two certain things. One other thing to think about is the existing party's possible harm is mediated by the fact that if they really wanted these parties in, they could easily bring them in under Rule 14 impleader. As joint tortfeasors, they easily satisfy the standard of is or may be liable. Now that's really important that they satisfy Rule 14, because Rule 14 is optional, so it's up to them. Whereas under Rule 19, if you say they're a Rule 19a party and you can't join them because of SMJ, then you might have to dismiss the whole case. So what we're really asking is it fair to dismiss the whole case when the screw manufacturer easily could have protected their own interests by simply impleading under Rule 14 one of these other parties? Hopefully this makes things clearer, and if not, we'll talk about it again later. But that's all I have for now. Thanks.